Welcome back. We're thrilled to have you here again. Today's topic is going to be measles. It's timely, it's been in the news recently, so we're going to talk a bit about how nutritional status can affect child's outcome when they're exposed to measles or they actually catch the virus. I'm Therese Nadler, registered dietitian. I'm here with Judy Converse, also registered dietitian, and we are here to talk about measles and just a more functional, integrative, and holistic approach to how your child can truly and should truly be in a healthier place than what is considered standard today in America.
Right, here we are. This is so topical right now, and a kind of a near and dear to, I think, our hearts as nutritionist dietitians, because this is when we talk about measles, it is an absolutely literal textbook example of how nutrition impacts the outcome of a disease for a child. I'm so interested in this.
Yeah.
It is like a literally a textbook story of what is the condition of the child before they are exposed, and specifically what is their nutrition status. And
Right.
this conversation is 100% absent from pediatrics in general, as you and I know, and that's kind of why we're doing this podcast.
And with measles, yes, I agree with you. The big emphasis is always on the kids that are not vaccinated. This is the problem, blah, blah, blah. But what people, I think, and this is what, the podcast was saying is like it really depends on your immunity level.
And I'm not talking about, do you give them zinc and vitamin C when they're sick? We're talking about the condition of the child before they get sick. And we've heard a little bit about that in the media, and there's a little bit of noise about how some of that doesn't matter. We can push back on that with other data, which is old, deep, and established, decades of this across the globe. You and I are both trained in public health nutrition, Therese, correct? So we have a grasp of nutritional epidemiology, which is specifically how do populations become sick, stay well, what nutritional impacts are on those outcomes. And measles is an incredible example. We had a monovalent measles shot, didn't exist when I was born. So I'm going to say I'm of the cohort that didn't get that, just didn't get that. I have in my generation cohort, there's 18 kids and cousins. I'm one of the youngest. I think there's two others a little younger than me. We all either got measles or got exposed to it. And at that time, the pediatrician would be more concerned if you didn't get it by the time you were 6 or 7 years old. Same with chickenpox. So that's very interesting. The shot came along, and just as a goofy anecdote, I remember being in fourth grade, and we were supposed to get a shot at school. I definitely did not like that, and I went and hid in the bathroom for a long time, and nobody
Avoid the
found
shot.
me.
Right. Right.
No one found me. And I kind of snuck out later and looked around and went, okay, I got away with that. What was I, 8 years old, 9 years old? So yeah, I never had that myself.
And I think like I do really feel like the needle has been moved a little bit based on the experience of COVID, right? So when you look at like how our country fared, all of the clinical conditions that, were comorbidities in COVID that for the people who had really bad outcomes, and I feel like logically this should make a lot of sense. You know what I mean? If you have poor nutritional status or underlying conditions that are perhaps not even, diagnosed, especially in children, you're going to have a poorer outcome. And I think also like for parenting, this is just a sidebar, like when my kid was really young, we were living in New York City and we were on the go a lot, right? Like I wasn't necessarily cooking at home as much as I do now. Like I had a crappy kitchen and we were in a tiny space and basically the goal every day was to get out of it, you know. But with that said, I was heavily reliant on those fruits and vegetable pouches. And if you remember, like a year or two ago, it was like, oh, they're laced with heavy metals, right? So you're giving your kid what you think is nutritious. Turns out it isn't. And then in addition to that, so maybe they're loaded with heavy metals. And then in addition to that, they grow into the toddler stage where eating a diet solely of chicken fingers, burgers, and French fries is acceptable in our culture. You know what I mean? And then you have an exposure to something like measles, and your kid is really set up to fail. Two thumbs down.
Let's zoom out and give a little bit of this nutrition perspective. One thing I want to say right up front is this quote: prognosis of uncomplicated measles is very good. Nearly all such cases recover. The previous condition of the child greatly increases the danger. So I pulled that quote today. Do you want to take a stab at when that might have been said or where
Ooh,
that might come
it's
from?
kind of got an old like
Old
English
timey.
style. Yeah, language. So I'm guessing 50s or 60s.
Okay, it is from this book.
Okay.
Okay,
Disease of children.
this book was published in 1912.
Oh, wow. Oh my
And there
goodness.
is a huge section. I love this book just for a history timepiece, but it's fat
It's a big
and the
one.
print is tiny. So it's a very info packed book. There is a large section on measles, including some plates with images to show you what the virus looks like. And I,
Yeah.
I think this is what is gone from pediatrics today is what do you do with a sick child? And with measles, you can get pretty sick. So if
Yeah.
you want to know about the actual course of a measles infection, dig up a book like this. Or, if anyone's interested, we can share the chapter on measles somehow. But
Yeah.
it's very
Bring it.
specific, very explicit what happens, what to expect. And we definitely have lost that in pediatrics. We all kind of expect to never be sick. And I think we're
Right.
afraid of being sick.
And I
So,
think, yeah, the biggest thing is that, if your child, like today, most children are, they're overfed, undernourished because they're
ooh,
eating the wrong things in large quantities. But the bottom line is that measles can turn from mild and something super recoverable into something else, that is potentially.
exactly.
And so that is where the nutrition piece
That's
comes in, and it's
so true. And
about the
sadly,
status. Yeah,
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, sadly, you're so right. And we've had a couple deaths reported from the current outbreak, which
yeah,
is very sad and very preventable, really. But we'll get into this as well. Is it preventable because of the vaccine? I'm going to tell you why when we get to it. I think the answer to that is no. But we can get to that. Let's jump on what you just said about the condition of the child and nutrition and what they're eating. Just yesterday came across a comment that, okay, this is not an issue in the US. In the US, we don't have malnutrition in children.
mm.
What would you say to that? And I would disagree, but let's go.
Same, same. I mean, on the surface, right, when you have a child that's of a healthy weight and perhaps meeting the growth chart standards, as many do following this sort of sad standard American diet that we have. With that said, that is certainly not going to set any child up to be able to defend against illness. Critical nutrient deficiencies, because you're not, even if the products you're eating are fortified lightly, as most of them are, because the truth is that fortification is expensive. As from a food manufacturer's point of view, adding in lots of vitamins costs more money. So they do, as a general rule of thumb, the bare minimum that's required of them. And that's also something to keep in mind when you're shopping. If you're shopping at a market and you buy like the house brands and it's significantly cheaper than the name brand, flip over that nutritional panel and look to see, is there any fortification in something like the cereal that you're about to purchase? Oftentimes, the house brand is cheaper because there is zero fortification in it. So that's just a sidebar note. But I do think, critically missing, particularly when it comes to measles, and I'm sure we'll touch on this, are like things like vitamin A, zinc, iron status is important, protein status is important, and we'll dive into all of this, but your child needs to be eating a well-rounded diet in order to be able to have a robust immune system to be able to manage infections that come in.
Bingo. And what I would ask you and anyone listening, what is your experience? When was the last time your pediatrician asked you about your child's vitamin A intake?
Never.
Or for that
Never.
matter, their protein intake?
Right. You know what? I imagine that my child is on the bigger side. We have tall genes in my family, so we're mostly at the top of that growth chart. But I have to imagine they would maybe ask about protein if your child was in that like 5 to 10 percentile range, on the smaller side.
Mhm.
But other than that, if your child is anywhere from like the normal range to the bigger size, they are really never talking about nutrition with you because they're just assuming, hey, they're hitting the growth charts or they're off the charts, and they're fine.
Yeah, and in my practice, as folks know, I had a pediatric nutrition practice for 25 years. I spoke with families from every state, other countries, and I overwhelmingly can assure you that no, pediatricians are not paying attention to nutrition per se. They do like that dot on the growth chart. They don't interpret it. Frankly, they might look at a dot on any given single day. They don't look at the trend. It's rare that they do. One thing I'll touch on right off the bat. that growth pattern is so important. So there's a lot of data on this. Even a mild or a low, I'm sorry, a mild or a moderate growth impairment will drop the child's capability in an infection. What is mild? What is moderate? What is severe for malnutrition? So when you hear our media here in the US saying, oh, the US doesn't have malnutrition, we might have a very small percent of kids in severe malnutrition. And there's very explicit criteria for what is each of that categories. Severe would refer to being, I believe it's less than 75% or less than your ideal body weight. Does your pediatrician know what your child's ideal body weight is? No. They
No.
don't
So
do that. There's rubrics for this, and it does take more time. And that's the job of a dietitian nutritionist usually. In fact, your pediatrician probably isn't even putting the dot on the growth chart. It's probably an assistant or
or the
someone
nurse.
else coming in, weighing and measuring your kid. So this information isn't engaged. Anyone can read up on the cycle of malnutrition and infection. It's a downward spiral. So, like you said earlier, we have children in this country who are overfed and undernourished. We have a lot of obesity, which is a big risk factor. If you look at a bell curve and you look at the two ends of it for weight, for age, let's say, on the very low end, you'll have children below the fifth percentile weight for age. They're very vulnerable, of course,
Mhm.
for infection. Their immune systems just cannot respond. They don't have the metal in them to actually mount a good response. They might not even mount a good enough fever. They will have more complications. On the other hand, of the other tail on that curve with obese kids, they have the same problem.
Yeah.
So it's not great either way. No one is engaging this information relative to infection and relative to susceptibility to infection. What we do have, in my experience in pediatric nutrition practice, was a lot of mild and even some moderate malnutrition. And again, those are very specific cutoffs for what qualifies as mild, moderate, and severe. You
Yeah.
will have immune compromise. So the same child exposed to measles, vaccinated or not, or the same child vaccinated with an MMR might have very different responses based just on a growth pattern that is compromised. And that can occur. I absolutely consistently experience this across my 25 years. Growth impairments are not noticed by pediatricians unless the child lapses all the way to the fifth percentile.
It's extreme to be picked up
It
on.
has to
Yeah,
be extreme. And when
exactly.
a child is starting to lapse, what you will see is first their weight for age will slow down. They'll be more slowly gaining weight.
Mhm.
And again, there's more specific criteria around lapses in weight gain relative to a child's age. So if a child age 1 gains no weight for 6 months, that is a big red flag,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
For
Yeah.
example, or if a child who is 7 gains no weight for a year and a half, that's a huge red flag. And I can't tell you how many times I captured these children and we had to redirect it. They were getting sick frequently, et cetera. If a child is starting to not grow taller very fast anymore, they lose their velocity, if you will, but let's say they've been on the 60th percentile for height, and then it starts to slow down and they're lapsing into the 40th percentile. That's a growth impairment. That can describe malabsorption, low protein diet. There's a bunch of things. That's going to hit a kid harder who gets measles, even if their weight for age looks okay or whatever. But see, none of this is interpreted in a 7-minute visit.
Right, right. And that's a function of the healthcare system and the health insurers dictating how a pediatrician can basically run their business,
Right,
which
exactly. They
is
have very little
problematic.
time.
Right.
And if
Right.
they,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think this has led to people, the dissatisfaction with the current standard of care in the, traditional medical system has led a lot of people to explore functional, integrative, complementary, and alternative approaches for this reason, because people do not feel seen or heard or even that it's of value, right? It takes time for you to go to that appointment. Take time out of your day, out of your child's day, go to that appointment, typically wait because often people don't run on time, especially in the larger practices that are a little bit
right,
more factory like. Then
right,
you go get rushed through, you spend, a tiny amount of time with the pediatrician. I'd say that visit is typically split between nurse and pediatrician or nurse practitioner. And then, you're kind of basically sent on your way most of the time. So yeah, I totally agree. And I think the other thing that's interesting is just a lot of measles death. deaths are not necessarily coming from the disease itself, but they're really coming from the body's inability to fight off the complications that
Right.
are caused by the disease. So whether it's pneumonia, diarrhea, dehydration, things like that.
Yeah. And even in this book that I was mentioning earlier, there's whole paragraphs on each of those complications. We were well aware of that over a century ago.
Yeah.
And the strategy there, what's interesting, what's different from a century ago, what's old is new, maybe. Here's how you nurse a child through that illness. Here's how you prevent the complications.
Yeah.
Here's what you do. Where is that knowledge now? And how is
Well,
that being applied?
yeah, I mean, I think what's old is new is actually very relevant because if you think about it, it's happening in a lot of facets of society, right? Like we had organic produce, which was not organic foods, right? They were natural foods, right? Then we got into the whole era where everything was processed, junk, chemicals. And then you had the rise of sort of organics again coming out of that in the late 70s, early 80s, and now it's much more mainstream. So I think in a lot of ways, we are, it's all cyclical and it's trending back towards what was common 100 years ago. Like sitting with your doctor, the rise of this idea of concierge doctors today, right? That's a concept, that was popular many decades ago that went out of fashion because, again, you have health insurers who get involved and say you have a max of 15 minutes with a patient, and therefore that medical model doesn't work in today's world. But you have, these doctors who are now commanding very large fees, and they will travel to you and they will spend 2 hours with you once a year, giving you a full rundown. So I do think the dissatisfaction of how the conventional medical system runs today is breeding a return to what was probably much more standard many
Right,
decades.
right. It will be interesting to see which way this all goes. I just want to share a quick anecdote. My husband, when we were first married, fell very ill, very, very ill. This was in the 80s, and AIDS was all the, I hate to say all the rage. I had a sibling die of AIDS, so I'm very aware of the horrors of that. And his physician was a little bit fascinated and convinced he had AIDS. And we were like, well, there's no behaviors here that. So, anyway, long short, after 3 months, the fellow who diagnosed him correctly was his childhood pediatrician. And this was a guy who went to your house as a kid, knew his whole family, and he was retired. But because we were living near the town my husband grew up in, he went to see him and he said, oh, he took a look at him and said, you have cat scratch fever. And we had literally just been given two feral kittens who were like terrors on wheels, and they scratched a lot. So he
Oh,
had gotten, I think the bacterial infection is Babesia, if I'm not mistaken. And he was so sick from that. Yeah, it took that old school look at the patient, eyes on.
touch them,
Right,
probably that
right.
there isn't much of that that happens today.
Right. And that's what we're looking at needing, I think, and figuring out how do we reintegrate that. And I want to touch back on going back to just nutrients relative to your status as a child before you get sick. You mentioned the key heroes in a measles infection: zinc, iron, vitamin A, and protein.
Yep.
And in my training, there wasn't necessarily a lot of measles vaccine always at the ready in these far-flung locations. I happened to do my training in Honolulu at the University of Hawaii, and I was one of maybe two white girls from the mainland. I was surrounded by people with already MDs, administrators. I mean, they were wonderful classmates from all over the world, and a lot of them from the Pacific Rim. I had a classmate who had done some work in Vanuatu. And no, the kids would get measles there, and she had firsthand experience where they were using the vitamin A strategy there. It was imperative for them. Let's talk a little bit about that. Can we share a little bit about some of that data, some of that experience? And I'm just curious
Yeah.
too, at Columbia University, a few years later, what was that conversation like in your training?
I can tell you pediatrics, from what I recall, because this is now going back on 11, 12 years ago, we probably did a little bit on peds, but it was mostly around growth charts. And there was certainly nothing that I recall that was specific to like, hey, when your child gets this, these are the things that you should look for. And I also think just from what I understand, and I'd love to hear your point of view on this, but like if a child is deficient in vitamin A, they're up to 50 times more likely to die of measles.
Right.
Is
This was very much in my training in the nutritional epidemiology context and what parts of the world were children succumbing because of that one piece. And then, of course, as they get sicker, they have a protein losing enteropathy. They have diarrhea. They're losing the protein they need to fight back. And it does become a downward spiral for those very vulnerable children. So it's almost as though the virus, once exposed, if it finds it's your body's weakness, it will capitalize on that, and the
Right.
complications can ensue.
And it burns through, the virus will typically burn through the nutrient stores quickly. So it's a
Exactly. And vitamin
function,
A, right.
right, of like you need to be in good nutritional status going in as best you can, keeping that nutritional status up, which can be a very big challenge when kids are very ill. They don't want to eat or drink, certainly less nutritious options become more, appealing. But then as soon as the recovery begins, assuming it does, getting that nutritional status back up is going to be very important as well.
Right.
So
Repairing
clear.
any lost weight is
Yep.
really important, and repairing those reserves. So micronutrients like vitamin A, you and I know, of course, we can store that. We can store it in some of our in our fatty tissue. We have like reserves, if you will. And when a virus like measles comes calling, it's going to deplete those reserves. That is true.
Yeah.
No one, I don't think there's any standard of care around checking a child's serum retinol, which is how you would measure vitamin A at the time of a measles infection.
Let's just go over though the
Yep.
food sources for vitamin A, just so people can understand, when your child is sick or if you're trying to, get their immune system robust heading into like, let's say, it's the fall and you're heading into the winter season, right? And you want to be prepared for any of the flu, RSV, things that may come up. But vitamin A is, egg yolks, carrots, sweet potatoes, squashes, many of our orange foods, some dark leafy greens, mangoes. These are the most, I think, common
Right.
sources that are
Yeah, and the
palatable.
egg yolks you'll see if you're willing or able to spring for pastured
Yes.
eggs, which are very expensive, or even organic eggs, you'll notice the yolk is bright orange versus a cheaper egg is going to be pale yellow. That
Yep.
color is coming from that vitamin A status or what the chicken's eating. So
Yeah.
those,
And I
if you
think
can afford it, those things matter.
And I think the most important part there is the pasture fed, because even organic, they could be feeding them organic soy and corn, which will produce, again, that is a grain-based diet. It will produce that pale yellow yolk. If you can get the pasture raised, where they're feeding the native diet of the grasses, it will be a bright orange color, which is actually
Right.
a lot more common. Like when we travel, you see it commonly in other countries.
Right.
Um,
I know I've heard of
and
vending machines in like Ireland where you can buy a carton of eggs in a vending machine. Or milk in a vending machine. Yeah, so that's we're so used to kind of dumbed down food in the US.
yeah, yeah, it's
And
not vibrant, right?
there's been this tension around, oh, it's elitist to eat better food. And I hope not, because it's better, it's better for you.
Yeah.
Another thing I might add to that list is cod liver oil, which I know can be touch and go for people, but you can which will have vitamin A in it. Now that's going to be different. This confused a lot of my clients. Different from just fish oil. It has to
Right.
be oil from the liver of the fish. That's where we store a lot of vitamin A. In fact, liver is another food you can eat to have
It is.
vitamin
I did
A.
mention liver because I mean, most of the time, it's funny. When I was a kid, my grandma used to feed me chopped chicken liver all the time. I did not put
Really?
together. Yeah. Oh, she
Did
loved
you eat
pasta.
it?
I ate it. I thought it was delicious. I finally, at some point, put it together. Like, what am I eating? But she always, that was like her appetizer. She always had the pate out with some cheese and crackers,
Is
before.
that okay? I gotta ask. So one thing we were fed a lot as kids was liverwurst.
No,
Is
no.
that different? I mean, I
Well, I
loved
don't
it.
know. I mean, I guess isn't liverwurst more like a sausage
It was
style
like a
or
big,
a patty too?
smooth thing that you slice. It wasn't like a sausage that you cooked like we think of sausage.
Today.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I haven't seen that in 1,000 years, and I used to love it. I used to love it. So that's a good one. Another one is if you use butter, and again, you can get like grass-fed or
Yep.
pastured butter, good vitamin A source. And same thing, it'll look more bright yellow. So these are foods that
Yeah.
just have in the mix all the time, have them all the time.
When we were traveling in Iceland 2 years ago, at the hotel we were at, they had the cod liver out for you to take a tablespoon or two of, just as part
Really?
of the buffet. Yes, just. that was Iceland's jam. They were very into
Okay.
that cod liver oil.
Yeah, they
Everybody
need that
was
vitamin D and the vitamin A up there,
right. It
probably.
was available just as part of like the breakfast regimen, which was, as a dietitian, I appreciated that. I'm sure other people who are unaware of its benefit are probably like, "What is
What's
this?" You know?
this? Well, I recall my dad, who was born in 1926, that his mom, my grandma, forced him take, she gave him cod liver oil. And
Yeah.
you can probably imagine in upstate New York, you didn't eat a lot of fish. You weren't near much
Right.
fish.
Right.
And he, as I became in whatever I'm doing in this niche in nutrition dietetics, and I would use cod liver oil, he couldn't touch it. He had
Was like
such a visceral memory. I don't think, it wasn't like what we get now where it's, got lemon or it's
they've
nice.
managed to make it more
Yeah,
palatable.
I'm sure it
Yeah.
was like pretty awful tasting stuff, but she fed that to her kids, and that was part of the deal. I want to mention one caveat with vitamin A: you can have too much of it, that it can
Correct.
become toxic. So I
Correct.
don't want to encourage parents to just take gobs and gobs of cod liver oil every day. I think it's difficult to get too much of it from your diet.
Agree.
Although
Yeah.
I will
It's
say another
still,
anecdote.
yeah, it's
One of
still
my
soluble.
siblings, yeah,
Yeah.
one of my siblings is vegetarian, and when she was very young, she went all in on carrots in a
Oh,
big
the
way.
orange tint to the
Yeah,
hands and
her hands
yeah,
turned
yeah,
orange. But
totally.
over the years, I had one case of a mom misinterpreting our plan, and instead of giving her 6-year-old child a teaspoon of cod liver oil a day, she gave him a tablespoon a day, and she did that all winter. And he did end up with some symptoms of toxicity. He had bone pain, headaches. That will go away. It will resolve if you just stop. But anyway, that's just one of the nutrients relative to measles, very impactful. And as you know, I'm sure and in my own practice, kids are not eating the rainbow a lot in the
Less,
US.
less so. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then another one we might touch on is iron.
Yeah,
And
iron's
again,
critical, I think.
kind of a not true story that we don't have malnutrition in the US. Iron, as I'm sure you know, has long been a key nutrient globally for children. Anemia is an issue. In the US, it is an issue. I believe it has not improved since I was trained. I don't, off the top of my head, we
Iron,
can back this up.
yeah,
Levels of
I don't.
anemia in the US.
I don't know. I do know, obviously, if your child doesn't love meat, and the thing is, like when they're not consuming animal proteins and they're growing rapidly as children are, you're at a higher risk of iron deficiency. So I will say, if you do notice that your child tends to like eat less animal foods, particularly when it comes to meats, that's something to make sure that your pediatrician is aware of, because then they can test for iron status, and that is important.
Right. This was another experience in my practice over the years. I captured many, many kids with anemia. They had not been screened by their pediatricians. I think a standard of care is, at a certain point, maybe around age 1, you get a heel stick. They're
Right.
looking at hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is not iron.
Mhm.
Hemoglobin, of course, being the protein that carries oxygen for us, and you need iron to make it. But and we may have talked about this before, if you look at a lab report for a hemoglobin level, the reference range is super small. It's maybe a spread of 2 or 3 points, if I'm not mistaken. So, meaning the body will absolutely waste iron out of any place else before it lets go of iron for hemoglobin, because you need that to oxygenate all your tissue, including the brain, of course. We do need iron for a lot of other functions,
Well,
many other
immune function,
functions.
critically. I mean,
Right? It's huge for immune function. So you can have a child go to the pediatrician, their hemoglobin's in range. It might not be robust, but it's not falling out of that critical range. And off you go. The pediatrician thinks you're fine.
right,
In recent years, there's been more interest in also checking something called ferritin, which I'm glad for. It's a storage form of iron. It's a protein, sort of like a checking account for iron in the body. And there are other parameters that can measure how much iron do you really have? Are you ready for measles, if you will?
right.
And of course, iron being both toxic and potentially poisonous and critical, you can't just dose it up and take supplements. You need to know exactly where your child is at. So I want to mention clinical signs of something called pre-anemia for kids. Before that, hemoglobin drops and then you're anemic. And it would be things like shiners under the eyes. They have restless legs. They don't sleep well. They're all over the bed in the morning. One of the questions I often would ask parents is, okay, when you go see your child in the morning and they're in bed, are they like upside down and inside out and the covers everywhere? Or are they like in
Right.
the same position? Right.
Yes, I know
And
that. If you've ever slept with a young child, there's a lot of kicking and arm movements and craziness that goes on in the middle of
yeah,
the
and if
night,
they're
typically.
going to sleep more soundly if their iron status is robust. Likewise, mood, it'll affect mood. We need iron to make and break down serotonin, dopamine, and things like that. So kids with weak iron status will tend to be more anxious or more easily upset, or they can't focus and concentrate. Of course, classic is, does your kid love the smell of gasoline? That's like a sure flag that you probably are heading for anemia. So all of these things, again, just like the growth chart, they don't get attention. It's
Right.
that, yeah. So
Right.
this is me pushing back on the statement that I've seen in the media that we don't have nutrition problems in the US for kids. Our
Mhm.
kids are fed. We're not the third world.
Oh, but
Mm.
we are in many ways.
Right.
Yes. And I also think, again, just to review like food sources for the parents out there that are, want to make sure their child is getting, adequate access to iron. It's, a lot of protein. So your red meats, your chickens, lentils are also a rich source, spinach, fortified cereals. So like I was talking about earlier, look for those. If you're going to get cereal, you want one that has some fortification in it. It's a great and easy way to get extra nutrients into your kid, especially if their diet is maybe only meh, not great. I think smoothies are a great way to sneak in something like spinach for younger kids. It's certainly a more palatable way to get them to try some of those greens, and you sneak it in there with enough fruits and they'll take it. But I think, again, providing that rainbow of foods, a variety of choices is going to be important, and the exposure early is going to help lay the groundwork for better eating habits
Yeah, it has
over
to happen
young.
all the way. It's not like you're going to throw all this at your kid when they get sick because they won't want it. It'll be too late. So yeah, this is again why getting away from that processed white diet is really important. And if your kid just can't, and I know we're going to do picky eating podcasts
Right.
and stuff. Yes, you need to talk about supplementing. You just do. You can't they can't get away with it. They're going to get sick more often and they're going to have more behavior problems if you don't. Yeah,
And they
so
won't
iron,
recover as quickly. That's
right.
the other piece. Your kid will hop from thing to thing to thing,
Yep.
and never fully recover before the next thing comes on. And then you're missing school, and then you run into problems, where, it can be too much school's missed. And also their ability to learn and keep up with the information that's being thrown at them gets very challenging.
Right. It sure does. And I love it in practice when I get to work with families and they're amazed that they get through winter and nobody got sick. Or maybe
Yeah.
there was one thing and it was no big.
Right. As opposed to like the rundown. And I will say, like, when your kid first starts going in a group setting, like let's say they're in a threes program or a pre-K program, they're going to get sick a lot because they're really being exposed, many of those kids, for the first time, on a regular basis. And also they're, oftentimes expected to be potty trained themselves, right? So you don't have someone there necessarily handling that part of it for them. They have to learn to like good hand hygiene, washing, things like that. So your child is going to get sick often.
Right. There's going to be a few speed bumps there. Yeah,
Yeah,
they weather that. They should weather it, bounce back. A good sign of an immune system developing is spiking a good hot fever. I
right.
was just
Let's talk about
watching,
fever. Yes, because a
right,
lot of parents don't realize that, right? So let's talk about fever, what it is, what it's doing in the body, and why you don't necessarily want to throw like Tylenol at it as soon as it spikes.
exactly. A fever, I've seen some specifics on what temperature fever kills viruses and at what rate. So it's something like once you get above 102, it's going to kill viruses at 200. It's going to slow down their replication by a factor of 200 and something. So it's
Right. And
very
that's the reason your
effective,
body spikes the fever, is it's
very
trying to
effective.
manage the virus.
Right. And I heard also another great piece of advice was to look at the child. It's not so much the number of the fever, like, oh, it's 102, it's 104. More important is looking at your child. Are they able to look at you, engage, talk, relatively alert?
With it. Yeah.
Or are they lethargic, unresponsive? That's much more concerning, and you need to be in touch with your doc. But if they're weathering it and they're talking and they're
Functional.
not incapacitated. Okay. And it's learning that discernment, I think, would be great for parents.
So you think letting the fever run for a bit, like, 99, 100, 101, so it can like hopefully burn out and slow down that replication of the virus, that is probably an okay strategy if the child, can communicate with you and be engaged.
Yeah, if they're engageable and you're not seeing those classic signs of dehydration that are concerning, where you might press into their skin and the skin should bounce back, they're
Right.
staying hydrated, they have clear urine, all those things are really important. The moment you see lethargy, confusion, unresponsive, of course, you need to be in touch with your doctor. You might need to get some IV fluids in your child. So, yeah, always important to be in touch on that. But to rush in right away with the fever reducers is going to make it hard for the body to fight. And as we all probably have heard, maybe you've heard acetaminophen in particular, where there is data linking it to outcomes on the autism spectrum when giving acetaminophen post-vaccination. And it
Yep.
depletes the body's glutathione, which is important for detoxification, and it kind of blunts the body's effort to get a viral vector, if you will, out.
Sure, but let's go back because I also think it's important to touch on zinc.
Yes, and
So
zinc is a
what's
little
the
different because unlike iron, it's easy to use a lot of it. It won't become toxic. It's not stored in the same way that iron is, but we do store it to some degree and it will be rapidly depleted with a virus like
And
measles.
right, if you are supplementing with zinc, and sometimes I will do this in the winter months, every 2 or 3 days, throw in a little extra zinc because again, it's great for supporting immune function, um, and making sure the immune system is working well. But you do have to be cognizant that too much zinc can cause a copper deficiency. So you don't want
Right.
to necessarily go overboard or do it every single day. It's really, I feel like a little therapeutic. I kind of drop a little extra in there, especially if the diet, my son's sick, so his diet isn't fantastic for zinc.
Yeah, and food sources again, it's going to be some meat, some pork, things like seeds, nuts, pumpkin seeds. I love
Yep,
using pumpkin seeds in pesto instead of walnuts because we have a nut allergy in my family.
that's great.
Yeah, so
It works. Yeah, also like beans, again, lentils,
mhm,
cashews are pretty rich, I think, in zinc. So,
yeah, and a pretty safe supplement to use. It is true it will derive some of these other minerals down. I think you can do that with iron as well. I'm always interested if I get the chance to have blood work on a child, I want serum zinc, serum copper, and serum iron, as well as ferritin and other iron parameters. Yeah, I will want that blood work so I can see that triad, that relationship between zinc, copper, iron, and
yeah,
and judiciously supplement. You can get anemia from a copper deficiency. It's a copper deficiency anemia. So all these things need to be balanced, and the key is your kid able to eat those foods ongoing day to day before they get sick? Very important. And one of the other things in that list was protein. So
yes.
what do we mean by protein? So what's protein status? Okay, there's different labs that measure that. There's a nutrition focused clinical exam where you look at a person, whether it's a child or an elderly person or what, and you can see signs of their protein status in muscle wasting or muscle tone, or how much, where their fat pads are on their skin. And fat pads meaning, are your eyes emptied, hollowed out?
Pumpkin, right.
Yeah, so there's different ways to look at that. In children, that progress for their height for age is going to be a big barometer for their protein status. So if that's chugging along, okay, that's kind of what milepost number one. That will describe that they're probably eating enough protein and they're assimilating it okay.
Yeah.
So that's important because your immune system is going to use protein to build immunoglobulin and a lot of the tools, which are antibodies, a lot of the tools you're going to build
Cells,
to
right.
fight.
Mhm. Now let me ask you this, because this is a question that I get, especially it's not common and it's not often, but what if your child is more of a plant eater, right? They don't love chicken, they don't love hamburgers. If they're eating mostly plants, is that cause for concern or is there enough protein in plants?
Yeah,
Or
I
do you,
think you can do it. You can get by with enough plant protein, and it's a look at the child's story. So I would look at that growth pattern and look at their Their height, their weight relative to their height. Are they underweight at all? Are they approaching underweight? I like kids the CDC and your pediatrician and all those guys are taught fifth percentile, cutoff, alarm bells, whatever. I'm
Red.
always looking at those trends. So if a kid was born at the 40th percentile weight for age, which would mean they might have weighed about 7 pounds, a couple ounces or so, if they're 4 and they're now at the 17th percentile, their pediatrician is not going to blink. But I see a problem. There's a problem there. That's a big drop. Anything more than a drop of 15 percentile points off your child's trajectory is an impairment. Clinically, that's an impairment. So that would warrant attention. And can you get enough protein from plant foods? I think the answer is yes. And the question is, are they absorbed and digested well? Are there sensitivities? Is it, look at the child, how are they functioning? How are they growing? How are they sleeping?
Also, if
And
they're eating dairy, that'll help too,
yeah, that's a protein source as well. So yeah,
Okay, great.
I think that can work fine. But all of those things together, it's I think our list is vitamin A, zinc, iron, protein, and
Yep.
their growth pattern. How are kids really doing who are getting measles? And all we're hearing about in the media is kind of like, measles. Well, what's the backstory on that? What are all their growth patterns like? We don't get to hear that. We don't even get to hear which ones are vaccinated, which ones weren't. And before we close on this topic, I really want to touch on that part of the story. So, first of all, here's another quote. This is from the World Health Organization. Measles has risen about 30% globally in recent years. And the World Health Organization, their quote is, reasons for this rise are complex and not all due to vaccine hesitancy. So I
Hmm.
think that in a nutshell confirms what we're talking about here today. There's other factors, and that was very much part of my training as well. What are those other factors? Where are the parts of the world where those factors matter? Guess what?
Right.
They don't just matter in Vanuatu. They matter
Right,
here
right. It
too.
spread. Right. I mean, we're all connected today,
Right. They
the
matter here
travel.
too. We have kids who are not well nourished. In my practice, I was much more often dealing with kids with growth impairments and underweight than overweight kids. So there's
Yeah.
plenty of those kids out there who are going to be vulnerable. The other thing that was so interesting to me was looking at, well, what has been the pattern of these outbreaks? So there was an outbreak in 2015, 2017, 2018, 2019. They keep happening.
Mhm.
And I went back to my 1912 Diseases of Children book, and here's what this author said. In large cities, epidemics occur every 2 to 3 years due to the fact that in this time, large numbers of children have grown up to the susceptible age since the last epidemic, which he said is age 3 to 7. So
Hmm.
here we have this vaccine stuff. He's talking about outbreaks every 2 to 3 years. And when I looked at this morning, there in the US, there's an outbreak in 2017, 2018, 2019. So it's like there's
Hmm.
vaccine failure here. And that's something else I really want to share about. They're not the panacea we hope, and they do fail. And as early as 1983, that has been the case. And 1983 is a long time ago. This is when the MMR vaccine was relatively new. This is reported in Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report. And okay, it says from December 19th, 1983 to January 13th, 1984, 21 measles occurred in Illinois in a high school. And basically, all the kids had been vaccinated, fully
Right.
vaccinated. And in the
Hmm.
end of this they sort of come to this conclusion that maybe it was the vaccine.
Well,
Like,
they aren't perfect. I mean, that's the other piece of this, right? Like, I think even when vaccines are designed, you're thinking about a bell curve, right? So there's always populate part of the population that falls on either side, the 10% at one side of the bell curve, right? So it's never perfect. And often they rely on this concept of herd immunity where you get enough people and theoretically everyone's, exposure is minimized. But I think
mhm,
COVID really showed the limitations of vaccines and how
right,
people react and respond differently to the vaccines. It's bio-individual in many instances, and it's not a perfect process,
right, right. Yeah,
Mhm.
they are fraught. And I think that's the message I'm really interested in sharing is they're not fixing the problem. And it isn't all because your neighbor doesn't like to use shots for their kids. It's not, that's not it. There's a lot of, as the World Health Organization says, there's a lot of factors here
Yeah.
driving this. And if more than any other infection, measles is a nutrition driven illness. It truly
Yeah.
is a nutrition driven illness. If you may be exposed and you will have a very different course than another child given your background at the start. And you're right, Therese, to point out it's the complications that will spiral a child into the danger zone.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other one last nutrient that I just want to give a plug for is vitamin C.
Yeah.
In general, vitamin C, fantastic, important for really immune health. And so that's another one to think about, as well, to make sure that your child is getting, because I do think, shortages of vitamin C will delay healing, right? It will, not it can help prevent some of those extreme complications that may occur. But I think that's another one that's worth
Yeah,
plugging.
all of these things are so important. As of today, it's right now it definitely falls incumbent on parents to be aware of these things. They're not going to get this information at the pediatrician's visits. The
Right.
system is not set up for that. Will it
Mm.
change? I mean, I hope. How? I'm not sure what the answers are, but knowledge is power, and you and I encourage parents to be informed and
And
learn.
advocating for your child, especially, I mean, the truth is that I find in particular, it's the moms, and we've talked about this previously. You have an instinct, you have a feeling, you have a gut about something like this isn't right, this isn't working, this isn't normal, like whatever it may be for any condition. Really going to the mat, I think, and advocating for your child is critical in with today's healthcare system.
Yeah, very important. Have we wrapped this topic? Was there anything we
I think
missed
so.
today?
I think we got measles. I mean, just the importance of nutrition is, critical, and food is medicine truly. So that is
Yeah,
something,
yeah.
to
And
work on.
keeping your children really well nourished, well fed, not overfed, undernourished. That's a big challenge in the US today. We're eager to help parents meet that challenge.
Yes, absolutely. Good talk. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thanks. We'll be back next time. We were going to talk about gaps today, right? Or
You were
restrictive
thinking about
diets,
gaps. Yep. Yeah, just in general, special diets for kids.
elimination diets,
Yeah,
and
could be
this
a part
popped
of it.
up, so we had to jump on it.
But maybe next time that's what we'll go back to, is the sort
Yeah,
of like, should kids be on elimination diets? What would merit consideration of that?
right.
Um,
All
okay,
right.
awesome.
Perfect,
Looking
Trey.
forward
Sounds
to it.
good. Let me
All right,
hit
take
the
care.